Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Productivity is Power 2 by Hilary Rettig. And this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Part 1, Effectiveness. Chapter 1, The Problem Isn't Laziness. You've probably noticed how people don't like talking about it when things aren't going well. How are you doing? You ask. If the answer isn't great, it's usually good, or at worst, okay. Sometimes a friend will tell you about their relationship, job, health, or even if you're really close, money problems. But there's one thing that people have trouble opening up about to even their closest friends, and that's their problems getting their work done. There seems to be something uniquely shameful about underproductivity. Yet so many of us have been there. The endless days and nights when you know you should be working, but you are doing anything and everything but. The more or less constant feelings of guilt, shame, and fear. The lies, such as telling yourself, I'll work on it tonight, when you know you won't. And telling your friends, I work best under pressure, when you know you don't. And telling your supervisor, editor, teacher, or colleague who is waiting for the project, it's almost done, when you know it isn't. The frantic couple of days before or after your deadline, when your fear finally builds to the point where you start working. Being fear-driven, however, you feel no real attachment to the work and are super distracted and inefficient. The death march all-nighters when every second feels like you're dragging a heavy weight. The feeling of defeat when you finally hand the work in, knowing it could have been so much better. And finally, the humiliation of getting a mediocre result and maybe a comment from your supervisor or colleague like, great idea, weak execution, or were you rushed? The problem is procrastination. Everyone does it at one time or another, so why all the secrecy and shame? Well, it's probably because we misidentify the causes. Many people think they procrastinate because they're lazy or undisciplined, but that's wrong. We procrastinate because we haven't been taught the attitudes and habits of productive work. Even worse, we've been taught some anti-productive attitudes and habits like perfectionism. Here's an example. Des started his master's degree program full of enthusiasm. He planned to get his degree in just 18 months, which meant taking 2 classes at a time. This was on top of his full-time job, long commute, and busy social life, but he didn't anticipate any problems. He liked staying busy and considered himself both well-organized and a good multitasker. But things went awry from the start. His classes turned out to be much more work than he had anticipated, with the reading alone taking at least a couple of hours a day. And it was difficult reading that he really had to focus on, so his plan of doing it during his crowded and distracting train commute was only partially successful. He had also planned on studying during his lunch hours, but that didn't work out so well either. Whether he tried working at his desk or down in the employee cafeteria, there were constant interruptions. Most importantly, he had planned on doing a solid 3 hours of schoolwork most weeknights. He hadn't anticipated, however, how hard it would be to focus on technical material and solve technical problems after a full day of doing the same at his job. And so, along with the usual evening interruptions, e.g. texts from friends and families, he also found himself frequently interrupting himself with snack breaks and going online to check various headlines and sports scores or to see how his gaming buddies were doing. And yeah, he'd often get sucked into a game. Another problem was that although most of his family and friends were supportive of his need to study, some weren't. We never see you anymore, was a common refrain, and it often worked, with a guilty Des abandoning his evening's plan to study to do something with the person. To be honest, he often welcomed the distraction. Weekends were supposed to be set aside for studying and assignments, but household chores like shopping and cleaning cut into that time. Also, he frequently hung out late with his friends on Friday and Saturday nights because he was entitled to a social life, wasn't he? And that meant a late start the next morning. To make matters even worse, just a couple of weeks after he started his classes, his supervisor, Tasha, assigned him a big new project. Normally, he would have jumped at the interesting work and higher visibility role. But now, already feeling overwhelmed and stressed, he could only pretend to be grateful for the opportunity. In the back of his mind was the growing sense that, I can't handle it all. But whenever he found himself thinking that consciously, he immediately shut the thought down. He was raised to be ambitious and to always do his best, In fact, he thought of himself as a machine who could take on any amount of work. Then the blow fell. Despite all his efforts and struggles, he got poor grades on his first couple of assignments. Des wasn't just humiliated, he was appalled, and his motivation never recovered. Both professors suggested he show up at some of the optional tutorials and also invited him to meet to discuss his work, but due to a combination of shame and time crunch, Des never did either. Des now found it harder and harder to do his schoolwork. He started skipping classes and spending more and more time on social media, binging television shows and gaming. Of course, he didn't give up without a fight. Practically every moment he wasn't working, he was haranguing himself to get your act together, stop being lazy, and think of all the money you're spending on tuition. You can't waste that. And worst, and most terrifying of all, if you fail, everyone's going to know you're a loser. At first, the harangues seemed to work. At least they were enough to motivate him to pull an all-nighter or two right before an assignment was due. Of course, he was miserable and underproductive at work the next day, and his grade inevitably suffered from the last-minute effort. But after a while, even the harangues weren't enough to motivate him. The only thing they accomplished was to make him miserable. Meanwhile, he was getting further and further behind, not just in his schoolwork, but at his job. Des knew that from the outside, at least, he looked productive. He was always rushing from place to place and constantly complaining, in a joking way, of course, about his ridiculous schedule and monster to-do list. More and more, however, he found himself, if not exactly lying, then shading the truth so as to not reveal his difficulties to others. He knew that some people at least weren't fooled, not his professors, and not Tasha, his supervisor, who, for the first time ever, had expressed disappointment at his work performance. Des had gotten off to a poor start with the new project, but he felt that he had no choice but to keep up the pretense. By the end of the first semester, Des had a strong sense that he wasn't going to be able to complete his degree, and so should put his schooling on hold at least for a while. Unwilling to admit that to himself, much less others, however, he enrolled for an additional expensive semester. By the end of that semester, however, he knew he had no choice but to quit his degree program. It was a fresh humiliation to have to admit to others that he had failed, but also an enormous relief to no longer have to keep up the pretense. Fortunately, most people were understanding, although a few clueless ones said things like, "You should have planned better." Some encouraged him to try for his degree again when his job was less pressured, this time taking just one class at a time. But Des didn't know if he would. He felt that his shame and disappointment would live on forever. To be continued. When you're stuck the way poor Des was stuck, the situation can seem hopeless, but it isn't. The first step to solving the problem is understanding the true nature of that complicated phenomenon we call procrastination. Sticking or not to the plan. Many people start the day with a plan. Maybe you write yours out in a planner or keep it all in your head. It could be something like this. Wake up at 7:30 a.m., be at work at 9, go to gym during your lunch hour, etc. Let's start then with a simple definition. Procrastination is when you get derailed from the plan or path you had intended to follow for the day. So instead of getting up at 7:30, you get up at 8 or 8:30 or later. Or instead of doing the work you're supposed to be doing in the morning, you get distracted by unnecessary busy work or someone else's project, or water cooler gossip, or social media. Or instead of going to the gym, you spend your lunch hour doing the work you should have been doing all morning. The key question is, what's derailing you? Often we have a quick answer to that. Me, I'm derailing myself because I'm lazy, undisciplined, uncommitted, etc. Not so fast. If you're like many people, you would do anything not to procrastinate and have been trying for years to break the habit. So it's pretty clear that you're not really in charge. I'll tell you who the derailer is in Chapter 11. For now, though, let's take a closer look at the phenomenon of procrastination, starting with 5 crucial points. Number 1, procrastination always has a cause, and it's not us. We know this because many people who procrastinate do so mostly in 1 or 2 crucial areas like work, or even just one work project or exercise. Meanwhile, they're dynamos everywhere else, including sometimes helping others with the same types of work they themselves are avoiding. It's clear, therefore, that they're not generally lazy, undisciplined, or uncommitted, but simply facing some additional barriers around those particular tasks. Number 2, our reasons for procrastinating are always valid. There are many reasons you might not feel like doing your work, including fatigue, illness, boredom, confusion, overwhelm, and distraction. These are all 100% legitimate, meaning understandable, forgivable, and human motivations. And so are the more frivolous seeming ones, like that it's nice out and you want to spend the day outdoors, or that you're lonely and want to hang out with a friend. The problem, in other words, isn't that you don't feel like working, but how you respond to that feeling, which brings us to number 3. Procrastination isn't a sin or character flaw, but a suboptimal response to our obstacles and barriers to doing our work. We all procrastinate sometimes, and a little procrastination isn't going to hurt you. But if our reflexive response to every obstacle we encounter is to procrastinate, then we've got a problem, because most of us encounter dozens or hundreds of obstacles every day. More on obstacles in Chapter 9. Number 4, you can't punish yourself out of a procrastination problem. Think about it. If punishments like shame, guilt, and deprivation actually worked, wouldn't we all be super achievers by now? Most procrastinators have been punishing themselves or been punished by others for years with zero effect, except that the problem got worse. Number 5, you can solve it, though. In fact, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of really effective solutions. Implement them, and you can achieve the central goal of productivity work, which is to be able to work as easily, effectively, and joyfully as possible within the limits of whatever constraints you may be facing. This goal encompasses 2 others. A, the ability to optimize your use of your time, skills, energy, cognitive capacity, Chapter 42, and other resources. And B, the ability to show up on time and do whatever work you're supposed to be doing with a high degree of clarity, engagement, focus, and fun. Because we all need fun, and fun is motivating. First, however, let's discuss the true cause of procrastination.